Welcome to the first live lecture of 2024. We have an amazing audience. There are more people than we ever had present here and more people online. So I hope you partially enjoyed the MOOC content that we prepared for you, but the rest of the year is going to be live lectures and or an invited lecture on the 7th of February. We'll have an invited lecture where Gabriel from a sustainability project in the south of France is going to give not a 90 minutes lecture, definitely not, but giving you some kind of a short overview what they are doing in terms of an alternative living project. So how can you live in a more sustainable way, less resource consumption, different style of building communities. They're doing quite some interesting stuff over there. I've been there last September. Yep, I think so. I've been there last September visiting them, having some chat with them. Anand will be there at some point in 2024. Quite interesting, obviously not relevant for your exam, but I can highly recommend you joining the session on the 7th of February, normal lecture time. So instead of a lecture, we'll have Gabriel here talking about the cat farm in the south of France. And yeah, will be really cool. But today, we're not going to talk about cats or farms or the south of France, but rather about concepts that go beyond the circular economy. Because in the past few lectures, we had first the circular economy, and then we also talked about the circular societies, because the circular economy in itself is not perfect. A statement that probably gets me fired, because TU Clausthal is the circular economy university, and claiming that it's not perfect yet might cause some trouble, but it's just the truth that the circular economy has some deficits, or at least some shortcomings that we have to overcome somehow else. So, therefore, in the introduction first, do a quick wrap up, because it's the first time that we're going to meet this semester. So the main idea of the circular economy was to essentially decouple economic growth from resource consumption. So utilizing resources that we have, making them into products, and then making sure that you get all the resources that you put into a product back without losing any of the resources and without causing any further environmental damage, and without compromising any of the resources that we have left on this planet. Obviously, that's a little bit tricky, and you most likely will never get something like 100% rate of doing this, either by sharing, repairing, reuse, remanufacture, or in worst case, even recycling. We also talked about the downsides of recycling previously. So there are technical problems to achieve that, but also some logistics, organizational, or even societal problems with that. And another shortcoming of the circular economy is that it essentially just tries to make capitalism more green. It doesn't really address underlying problems that capitalism as an economic system that is driving our society right now is creating. So we're just trying to make it a little bit better, but it's not really fixing underlying problems. And as an alternative, we also talked about on a high level about circular societies, which try to go beyond just these economic aspects and also try to look at society problems, try to figure out different ways of approaching those issues. But we stayed on a rather high level with respect to that. So I didn't really suggest you any tangible things you could do as an alternative to a circular economy. So that's what we're going to do in the next at least 2 lectures before we talk about the cat farm on the 7th of February. And we're going to start with the concept of sufficiency. Then we make a little bit of a detour that might actually impact your work life in the future. And then in the next week, we're going to talk about, in German, it's called Gemeinwohlökonomie, or economy for the common good. And we're also going to talk about concepts like universal basic incomes as modern ways of approaching the overconsumption problem that we might have that causes quite a lot of the environmental damage that we're suffering right now. This is then fueling the 3 main challenges that we had. So climate change, environmental pollution, and resource scarcity. So all of this, what I just showed you on the slides, we've already seen before. It's essentially criticism on the circular economy, circular societies as an alternative, and arguing that we need to consume less. So, first, we're going to talk about sufficiency, or eco-sufficiency in English. In German, it's just Suffizienz. Before we talk about sufficiency, eco-sufficiency itself, I would like to talk about eco-efficiency and eco-consistency before, so ecological efficiency and ecological consistency. We've talked about this in one way or another, mostly implicitly before, when we tried to deploy different technologies to make something more efficient, like use less energy, or to use less resources to get to the same results, essentially being more efficient with respect to efficiency. So, So minimize the material input required to achieve a certain economic result by improving the ratio between the use of resources and the production of goods. We have exactly 2 people in the audience. What's a good example for eco-efficiency? Come on, how can you make something more efficient in a sustainability context? So I give you a car that consumes 10 liters of petrol for every 100 kilometers. What would be a way to make it more efficient? So essentially reducing the consumption of petrol per kilometer per 100 kilometers. Yes, you could do so by making it more like so that it can drive like more efficiently, either like different tires, or that you have less resistance to like when you drive through the air or stuff like so, either resistance on the ground or through air, or you could make it more lightweight, and then instead of 10 liters, it suddenly uses like 3 liters. Okay, now the example was 6 liters, so 10 wasn't a really good example. But you could try to reduce the consumption of petrol. You could try to do the same with an apartment by insulating it better so that you can cut the insulation, the power or the amount of heating energy that you need to heat your apartment by insulating it better, or by getting a smaller apartment. So this is mostly like this insulation or cutting the consumption of petrol would be an efficiency example. You're trying to do the same, like 100 kilometers driving, just with less resources. Eco-consistency is focused on trying to limit the damage intensity or the environmental impact of the resources used. So now you are thinking about, okay, if I need to get 100 kilometers, how do I cause as little damage as possible? And if we essentially take the idea of a circular economy, how can I do the same with less damage to our society or our planet? And the example could be a battery electric vehicle that instead of using energy coming from burning dead penguins, you use green energy like solar, wind, or something else. So you're trying to do the same just by doing less damage. If that is the case for like solar, wind versus burned dead penguins is up for discussion, but you get the idea. So efficiency, making something more efficient, consistency, trying to cause less damage while doing so. And if we then look at an example where we combine efficiency and consistency, we're talking about first minimizing the fuel or energy consumption of a car, and then second, operating the car with something like carbon neutral fuel or energy mix. So just to give you like an idea for this very specific case of mobility. So now, what is sufficiency? I know I don't want both of you to never show up again, but do we have an idea what sufficiency or Suffizienz is? Have you heard of this concept before? Okay, some head shaking. This is why you are here, I guess. So I brought, like as is for the sustainability aspects or many other definitions, there are hundreds of definitions out there, so I brought you like 2 descriptions here, 1 definition, 1 description. One coming from a really nice author called Thomas Princeton, who describes sufficiency as seeking enough when more is possible, which is both intuitive and rational, and personally, organizationally, and ecologically. And under global ecological constraints is also ethical. So essentially what he's saying, obviously I could consume more, but why would I do so if I already have enough? If you're hungry, you eat, I don't know, 1 piece of something. Maybe you're really hungry and you need 2, but why should you eat 100? My dogs would do so because their solution is just to vomit on our carpet and then continue all over again, because they don't understand the concept of sufficiency. But you, as intelligent human beings, should do so. So sufficiency is essentially, do I have enough? Yes, then why should I consume more? And even though this sounds to be a relatively simple and rational concept, as we have discussed many times before in this lecture, we're still doing this for whatever reason. We're consuming way more than we actually need and actually should do. There's also a definition from the IPCC. You might recall the IPCC reports from previous lectures. They provided us those nice examples with respect to the difference between 1.5 and 3 degree global warming. They're also giving out these reports on a regular basis on how to act, or essentially giving like ideas for politicians on what to do. So like one of those rather nice sources. And in one of their reports, they defined sufficiency as a set of policy measures and daily practices that avoid the demand for energy, materials, land, water, and other natural resources while providing well-being for all within the planetary boundaries. So how can I have enough? How can I do nice without breaking our planet? Without breaking our ecosystem? So essentially, we're very close now to the sustainability definition. We said taking care of our needs without compromising the needs of future generations. So what do I need to do good, but not more, not less? And when we said sustainability is consuming less, sufficiency could be defined as all you need is less, which is accidentally also the title of one of the books that this lecture is based on, from a German lecturer called Nico Peck and a colleague who wrote a book together. It's not a scientific source, but a rather good idea or like an entry point to get into this concept. Okay, what is sufficiency? How much do you need? To now put this a little bit in a different scenario, just as another example. We had mobility as one example. Let's now look at your apartment or like shelter as another example. So you're all probably not living on the street or not in a tent or not in your car. That means you probably have some kind of apartment. I suspect it's not a 120 square meter apartment for most of you. So this is just coming from the book, so I just like used the same numbers. So usually, no matter whether you're living at 10 square meters, 50, 60, or 120, you have a size of your apartment. And if it's not a super old building, you also get, when you rent the apartment or buy an apartment, you get a certificate that tells you how much heat you need per square meter per year. So 130 is neither really good nor really bad. 130 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So not bad, not good, but that gives you some kind of idea. So energy efficiency would now be insulate the apartment in such a way that you need less energy to heat it. So minimize the heat demand as much as possible would be efficiency in the terms of eco-efficiency. Usually when you rent an apartment, that is rather difficult to do for you. You can try to just say, okay, instead of 20 degrees in my rooms, I'm happy with 15 degrees or 10 degrees. You might get the mold problem depending on where you live and how the house is built. But essentially you could also say, look, I just refuse to heat. I'm just gonna be less comfortable in my home. But insulating would be a different approach. Consistency would be minimizing the ecological damage by choosing the most sustainable way of heating. One of our students is currently working on a website calculator to visualize this problem. So usually you cannot really choose how to heat your apartment. Is it gas? Is it a wood stove? Dead penguins? Electricity? Anything else? Like there are different ways of heating your apartment. And which of those is more sustainable than the other? Is a wood stove more efficient because wood trees are essentially a natural resource that can regrow compared to gas? Is electricity better because it might come from solar or wind, even though solar in winter is a rather limited resource? So what's the most efficient thing? And essentially, one of our students is building a system or a web calculator to visualize that problem, but it has limited implications or applications because usually you cannot really choose it yourself when you're renting an apartment, but you could use it to first understand what is one of the most efficient ways to do so, and then also you could use it to make decisions in case you are buying a new home, or you might find yourself in the position of renovating an existing apartment or home and then making a most sustainable decision yourself. So how do I minimize the ecological damage by choosing the most sustainable way of heating? First of all, I try to heat as little as possible, efficiency. So if I have something like a passive house that doesn't need any heating at all, then obviously I don't really have a consistency problem. If I need 0 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, then I don't have to think about the consistency problem in the first place. And then sufficiency would be living in a smaller apartment or utilize less space per person. Personally, I don't have a clue what to do with 120 square meters. So I have 2 dogs, I have a wife, we're living in something like 75 square meters. Sure, I would like to have like some more space to have all our tools and some other stuff like nicely sorted. But I could actually live with less. So 75 for 2 people and 2 dogs is, in my personal opinion, more than enough. But I also don't want to move to just get down to 50 or 60 because right now, like, moving is also expensive, it takes time and so on. So, but just like giving you an idea. We could also take on another roommate and say, okay, look, instead of having 2 people on 75, we're upgrading to 3 or 3.5 or 4 people. So essentially, when you have a big property or a big house, you could also say, look, we're just going to cut it into pieces and say more people utilizing the same amount of space and therefore less space per person, which means we heat the same amount of space, but for more people, thereby reducing the impact that we have on the environment. So I'm okay with having less, and I'm still doing good. Like 75 is very, very big for 2 people. So, but there are some problems with this efficiency and consistency problem, because it allows us essentially to have 2 major options. So I can continue living a nice way or a nice life using less resources if I do this in a more efficient way. So if I insulate my apartment better, I need less heat to do so. And if I reduce the amount of energy, fuel that my car needs to get me 100 kilometers, then I could just say, okay, I get the same, but it uses less resource. But what's often happening is that we live an even more comfortable life using the same amount of resources. So now that I need less fuel energy to get 100 kilometers, suddenly I'm like, yeah, if it doesn't cost me anything, because that's usually the implication that you have, it doesn't cost me that much anymore, then I can go further. And if you're living in a small apartment, and before you're used to reduce your heating and just keep a little bit more cold, and now you're like, okay, this is much more well insulated, and for the same price, I get twice the heat in my house, or I get twice the amount of food. So you lack an incentive, or you lose an incentive to behave more sustainable. And this is unfortunately what happens more often than it should, that efficiency leads to a lack of consistency. So suddenly we're saying, look, we need less, and in order to cause the same damage, we just do more. And that is one of the major problems that also are connected to this technological Jesus thing, where we say technology is going to save us by making everything more efficient, but instead of staying on the same level of comfort and consumption, we just increase consumption again and again, because now it just costs us less, but overall it costs us more because we're not willing to go or to move towards a sufficiency approach. So the combination of efficiency and consistency promises to maintain your individual freedom of choices by fixing ecological challenges and downside using technological or political actions. And it also suggests you that you do not have a personal responsibility, or even worse, that you can buy yourself out of this mess. If you just pay for a battery electric vehicle, it doesn't matter that you drive more than you did before with a petrol car. If you just buy a CO2 certificate, you still can go and travel by plane. If you just buy all the nice, bio-friendly, happy chicken meat, and you can still eat as much chicken as you want, maybe even more, because now you're suddenly killing happy chickens instead of sad chickens, which sounds weird in some way, but you get the idea. But usually this is high price, and this is essentially something that churches used to do in Europe for quite a while. You do something bad and you get a get out of jail card for free by just paying a higher price or some kind of a fine. This is what a lot of eco projects and products are like. Pay more and then you're fine. You can do whatever you like as you did before. So we didn't really evolve much in the last few hundred years when it comes to this concept. So this is one of the, or like a larger chunk of this big problem of efficiency and consistency problems, where sufficiency could help us out a lot. And this is why we're also talking about eco-sufficiency as an alternative or as a solution. There's also another dimension of sufficiency versus consuming more and more. Because you have a 24-hour day, and in order to consume something, you need some amount of time. You do consume something to satisfy a certain need. That could be basic needs like shelter, water, some food, companionship, love, whatever. But in order to consume each of those and to utilize the benefits that you get from consuming this, you need a certain amount of time. You could put this in seconds, minutes, hours, whatever. But this gives you an upper limit of how much you can consume per day. You cannot consume an unlimited amount of resources and things per day if you only have 24 hours a day. And satisfying your needs, at least in a first world country, is relatively simple, because usually you have, of course there are like some exceptions, but usually you have ways and means to satisfy your basic needs, like food, shelter, water, and other stuff. Then you have, given a certain income, ways of making your life even nicer. So instead of just having a tent, living in the forest, you might have the option to rent a small apartment and live there, and then you have Wi-Fi, it's warm, you have everything you need, maybe even have a dog or a wife or like a husband or whatever, and then you're good. And if you have even more money, it more means you can try to consume even more. You can go on nice vacations, not even once a year, but I don't know, every other weekend. You can buy a new car every week. You can buy a new iPhone every week. You can buy a new computer. You can, instead of having an apartment, you buy a mansion or a castle. So you can essentially push this to the utter limits. But there's still a limit of how much happiness and well-being you can consume in a certain amount of time. And that essentially leads to the figure behind me. You can get a lot of extra well-being, of individual well-being, by consuming the first few things that make your life much better, like having a roof on top of your head, of having water, of having food, of having healthcare. Like that makes your life so much better right away, up to a certain point where you have all your basic needs covered. And then you can get some extra nice things that make life just a little bit easier, just a little bit more nice. And that still increases your well-being. But over time, the more you have to consume, the more you want to consume, which sounds a little bit unintuitive, because why would you do that? Because marketing tells you, you're unhappy now, you're stressed right now, maybe because there is an exam coming up. But if you just buy this food, this fast food, or if you just buy this tool, then you feel better. Or by putting a lot of really cool pictures of people doing extreme sports or being super fit or healthy and happy in front of you, and then telling you if you just buy this iPhone, you will also be super happy. You're starting to get into this point of overconsumption, of overstimulation, where you're trying to fix problems that you might actually have, or not have because people told you you have this problem, and then you're getting into a problem where you have to consume more than you actually need and actually want to. So you have an overstimulation, you have a lack of time, you have a stress because you need to consume all of this. Some of you might have experienced this when you, for example, go on vacation. So now I have 1 week to go on vacation, and I want to experience as much as possible while being on this vacation, because I might never get back to this country. Or when I'm back, I have to go to work, or I have this other exam coming up. So now I want to make the most out of this time that I have. So I cannot just sit around and do nothing. I have to do something. I have to utilize this time. So for example, I experienced this with my parents. Like they're very much, like when they go on their vacation, they are very structured. They have a very structured approach to vacation. I used to be the same. Now I have like a different approach to that, but they make the most out of their vacation. There's a plan, and then you go through like all the things you could do on vacation in a certain place. Same goes for like going out for like an evening with your friends. Look, I have this one evening, and then I have to go back to studying, or now I have 2 hours to do something. Now I have to make the most out of this. And this is essentially feeding into this overstimulation, lack of time and stress thing, that even your free time is now utilized. You also have this in the context of social media networks, where the most precious currency that they have is your attention, that each and every piece of your attention is monetized. Who gets most of your attention and then monetizing it? How do you get most of your attention? By stimulating you, by giving you certain emotions, by overstimulating them. And you have to consume all of this, and then you continue scrolling through your feed on Instagram, Reddit, Facebook, TikTok. I'm too old to have all the cool apps in my head right now, but you get the idea. So long story short, what I'm saying here is, right now, our society and also the circular economy is structured around consuming as much as possible, even if it doesn't make you happy anymore, and even if it goes way beyond what you actually need and want, so way above the sufficiency concept. So thinking about what is it that I need to make me happy and what is essentially unnecessary nonsense is one of the parts that would feed into a circular society instead of a circular economy. So not just decoupling economic growth and resource consumption, but also thinking about what do I need for a happy life, and thereby we're back to the sustainability definition. Good. Questions so far? Because otherwise we would go into a small detour. Good. This might sound a little bit weird in the beginning, but I hope it makes sense in the end when we finish. This detour is based on a book and on an article that was once written by an anthropologist called David Graeber. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago, even though he was quite young. But it's an interesting thought experiment that he made and also supported with some quantitative information and data. So let's see where we're getting here. So we just talked about sufficiency. What do I need to be happy? Previously, we talked about sustainability. The most sustainable thing you can do is consume less, very much connected to sufficiency. So if you consume less, that also usually means that you need less money to cover your living costs. If you don't buy an iPhone every week, you spend 1.5K per week less. If you don't buy a Starbucks coffee every day, you probably save $5 a day or so. So you need less money to still get by. Lower living costs means you would probably need to make less money, right? If you only need, instead of 5,000 euros per month, let's say you only need 1,000 euros per month, that means you could also reduce your work time. Radical concept, most people don't do that. They just try to save more money or they continue to consume more. But let's just follow this line of the context. And especially if you compare your way of work and your lifestyle today to something that your parents did 20, 30 years ago, or even your grandparents, or even people 100 years ago, you should also assume that now, given all the technological advances, especially in like manual manufacturing jobs, that there should be a much higher output and therefore less work required to get the same amount of stuff. So when it comes to mass production or agriculture or anything, like usually technological advances lead to the point where you need less workforce to do the same amount of stuff. That's essentially what the Industrial Revolution gave us. So even less time required to get what we need as a society to survive. And one of the most famous economists essentially predicted that 100 years ago. John Maynard Keynes predicted a 15-hour work week in an essay that he wrote in the 1930s, where he said, technological advances are going to push us so far that we barely have to work anymore. And that's being said in a time where it was totally normal to essentially work way more than we did today. So there are lively debates since he published that essay pertaining to Keynes' prediction, especially, of course, among the economists who were quite scared to admit that maybe less work is still fine to do the same amount of work. The main problem is that Keynes did not really account for the massive increase in consumerism. The majority of people choose more toys, more pleasure, more consumption over less work hours. That was a problem when he made this prediction. That is still a problem 100 years later. Instead of just saying, look, I'm going to use less, I'm going to work less, I'm just going to consume more, because there are always ways of incentivizing me to consume more. And most people don't really think about this and just follow the masses with respect to this problem. So even though his prediction with respect to technological advances going to make it easier to cover all our needs, it essentially couldn't really predict that we're just going to consume more. But that contradicts our sustainability paradigm and therefore puts us once again into a little bit of a problem. And before we get into the actual point of the detour, I would like to show you briefly this figure to get you a little bit of an intuition of how the shift in labor force developed over the last 160, 170, 180 years since now. Because when you look at the yellow and red graphs, so industrial workforce and agricultural workforce, you can clearly see that Keynes wasn't far off. So previously in 1850, more than 60% of the labor force worked in the agricultural sector, just to make sure that everyone has enough to eat. And right now it's, I don't know, 2, 3, 4%. It's really difficult to even make this out on the graph. So there was a massive technological shift that helped us to make this way more efficient, to maximize the efficiency of food production in the agricultural sense. For industrial purposes, we got up a little bit and then went down, so right now we're still more or less where we started off in the 1850s, but obviously we're producing way more than we ever did before. If you compare the industrial output nowadays, especially on a global level, to 1850s, I don't know how much more we're doing, but various dimensions more than we did before. What went up heavily is the so-called service sector. So administrative, bureaucratic, but also service provision in the sense of healthcare and other stuff, and teaching and so on and so on. So output-related industries went up drastically. So from slightly more than 20% to, I don't know, say slightly below 80, something like that. So there was a very heavy shift due to technological advances, but services went up because it seems like they are not really related, or they do not really seem to be impacted by this technological advancement that Keynes was focusing on. So he didn't essentially really predict this part here. So what we're now getting to is what Graeber called so-called bullshit jobs. It sounds a bit provoking. That's probably what he intended to do so. And it essentially started with an essay that he published in 2013 and then made into a book in 2018. So as I already said, he was a professor for anthropology at the London School of Economics, if I'm not mistaken. And he thought about a problem that a lot of people at universities often discover. He was like an academic person himself, but also a lot of people who work in heavily corporatized environments, that you get the feeling that the tasks you do, the work you do doesn't really matter, or that you get the feeling that there's not really a point doing so, or that someone else could do it so that you could automate it, or that the world wouldn't be a worse place if no one would do your job, or if I would just say, yeah, sure. Like someone's gonna check what you did and then gives you some credit points or some goodies or some incentives to do so. Incentives could be money, but that you're like, why am I doing this? Does this make the world a better place or a worse place, or doesn't have any impact at all? And when he looked into this problem as a researcher, he made the claim that there are some jobs that he would call bullshit jobs. And because it would be quite mean, unfair, and even degrading to just go to someone and say, look, your job is a bullshit job. You are not worth anything. He chose a definition that make it dependent on whether the person has the impression of whether the job that the person is doing has like any meaning or sense or purpose or not. So it's not like I'm going there and saying you have a bullshit job, you are not necessary. So a definition that he chose back then was a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. So essentially you're like, why am I doing this? Because someone told me so. Why are you doing the homework, the exercises for this lecture? Because I told you so. Why are you submitting an empty piece of paper as part of this exercise? Because I told you so. And why are you doing it? Because you're not paid, but you want to do the exam. Why are you doing the exam? Because you want to get further in your studies, you want to earn a lot of money, blah, blah. You get the idea. Why am I forced to give you this exercise loophole to utilize or to jump through? Because the university forces me to do so. So we could trace this back a little bit, but you get like some kind of an idea of this. And usually, if you go to basic economic courses, what he described shouldn't exist. Because the main economic model that is driving our society is capitalism, and capitalism should not allow for such type of inefficiency, where someone is doing a job that doesn't seem to have any value and doesn't get you any further, because that would be inefficiency. And usually what you learn in first semester economics, so I also like previously studied banking and finance, I got kicked out, but I did like 2 semesters of economics. What you learn in the first semester is markets are always efficient. They find the most efficient solution. So what he describes there shouldn't exist in the first place. But quantitative data contradicts this assumption. So people experience this even though it shouldn't exist. And when he asked, like when he collected people who had like their experiences, who had the source, he got like various types of inputs, and then he tried to categorize those experiences and jobs that people told them that they have, and where they describe, look, I think I have a bullshit job, and try to put them in different categories. And he came up with 5 broader categories, first being flunkies. And flunkies serve to make their superiors feel important. So receptionists, administrative assistants, store attendants, store greeters, makers of website whose site neglect ease of use and speed for looks. So essentially jobs where you could say, yeah, they have a certain purpose, like we also have assistants, administrative assistants, they help us. So that doesn't mean that because like going back to the definition, it doesn't mean that all administrative assistants are bullshit jobs, but there could be some of them. And when you think about a store greeter who's standing 8 hours in front of a store and telling you, hello, 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 there might be some people who think, like, yep, this is gonna make this a better shopping experience. But I guess we can make a certain, like, even if we might have different opinions on the actual, real final conclusion here, you could maybe argue that there's better use of time for that person instead of standing there for 8 to 10 hours and saying, hello, have a nice day, please leave as much money as possible here, otherwise I'm gonna get fired. So flunkies being essentially jobs where you have superiors who would like to have you to make their life a little bit better. Next are so-called goons. They act to harm or deceive others on behalf of their employer. Could be lobbyists, corporate lawyers, telemarketer, public relations specialists, community managers. So a group of people where he argues that they don't make life on this planet for the majority of people better. If this group of people would disappear one day to another, would the planet be a worse place if we don't have lobbyists lobbying for oil companies to continue destroying our planets? Would be like one example. Duct tapers, they temporarily fix problems that could be fixed permanently. So programmers repairing bloated code, airline desk staff who calms passengers whose bags do not arrive. So you have an underlying problem which you might be able to fix, but it's way cheaper to not fix it and instead just pay someone to deal with the consequences. Box tickers, they create the appearance that something useful is being done when it's not. Survey administrators, in-house magazine consultants, corporate compliance officers, quality service managers, lecturers who ask you to submit empty pieces of paper so that I can tick a box, that I ask you for homeworks, and you can tick a box and say, look, I submitted all the homeworks ahead of time. You could actually send me all your homeworks right now for the rest of the semester, just saying, look, this is my submission for exercise 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, thereby I tick a box. So that will make you box tickers and me a complicit in making you box tickers. And then you have the taskmasters. They create extra work for those who do not need it. So middle management, leadership professionals. If you ever work at a university as a Hiwi, you will get to fill out Hiwi work time sheets. Sometimes they actually mean something. Most of the time you will be asked to fill them out so that they can go to HR. HR puts them somewhere in a secret box and no one ever touches them again. But we're all required to do that. And from those 5 basic categories, he tried to derive further assumptions and further analysis. I'm obviously cutting this short now because it's been quite a few years of research that he put into this book and this essay. But essentially he tried to figure out more about those jobs where people think this doesn't make sense. Why am I doing this job in the first place? Besides the fact that I need some money to put food in my fridge. Like, do these jobs serve any purpose? Would the world be a better place without or with these jobs? And the only reason why having these jobs makes sense is because I'm gonna get paid for this. I'm doing this job because otherwise I don't have money to feed myself, to essentially feed or to cover my own needs that I have when you think back to the figure that we had before. So he also described a phenomena that he called, I mean, all these words are like trying to engage you, to provoke, to start a discussion. So he called it bullshitization, which is a rather unscientific term, but we were gonna go with this. Transition of meaningful job into a bullshit job through corporatization, marketization, or managerialism. So you start out with a job of, for example, a climate scientist, a sustainability manager, or something like that. So you get to the job and say, look, I have the understanding that my job is to make this world a better place. But then you start the work, and you discover that most of your work is going through various types of standards, administrative work, and other stuff, so that suddenly 90% of your work time is just covered with tasks that fall into one of those 5 categories. So ticking boxes because someone gave you a standard that you have to adhere to, and then you have to make sure that everything you do adheres to the standard. Or you have to tick those boxes, or you have to fill out work time sheets, or you have to check your underlings that they do fill out their work time sheets. And you get someone to work for you, even so you don't have time, like any use for this person, or you want to do a project but you don't get money for this. So essentially 90% of your time where you're trying to do your actual job suddenly ends up not being that useful. And I can attest to that as someone working at a university. I was hired because I'm really good at doing research. This is why I'm being hired as a professor. I wasn't hired because I'm good at teaching, because no one ever taught me to teach. There was no formal education for me to teach. I got a PhD for research. I got hired, or like most of this, what I was not like famous in quotation mark, what I was known for was good research. But nowadays, I spend 10% of my time doing actual research. The other 90% is teaching, which is quite fun, writing proposals, managing teams, doing administrative work for the university, doing administrative work for my team, talking to people doing weird stuff. So also my job has a certain part of bullshitization where I'm suffering from this corporate marketization and managerialism problems. So I'm good at doing something, but I'm rarely getting the opportunity to do so. You'll probably experience something similar when you're working in a company, either now or in the future. And when looking into numbers and collecting like experiences from people who think their jobs are not really doing that well and don't seem to have a lot of value, you also try to gather various statistics. And those are essentially very similar to the work-labor force statistic that we've seen before. We saw that, okay, industrial and labor and agricultural labor force going down, but service forces go up. And service is essentially managers, marketing, administrative stuff, but obviously also healthcare and other stuff, but still. And when he looked, for example, at the full-time staff for academic institutions, in comparison to student enrollments, you might think, okay, twice the amount of student means twice the amount of people that you need to manage them. If I have twice as many people, I might need twice as many lecturers, twice as many administrative staff, and so on and so on. But if you look at the changes from 1976 to 2011, and then on the other side, 1976 to 2018, you can see that the student enrollment went up by 91% or almost 80%, and the faculty, so lecturers and other stuff, they more or less like went the same pace, so 80–90%. But if you look at the executive, administrative, other professional or non-professional stuff, you can see that especially the administrative and other professionals went up by a much higher percentage than any of the other jobs. So that means with every student, for example, we get 4 times, with every student we get 4 administrative people. So how could you justify this? Does suddenly every student cause 4 times more work than it did before? Obviously, it's not only the university's fault or the administration's fault, because government also like create new regulations or rules that need to be adhered to. But still, like students went up 91%, and administrative and other professionals by almost 400%, or even here like 450%. So 80% compared to 450%. So there's a huge gap in this field. And this can also be experienced and quantified in terms of numbers for other fields. That the actual workforce that does productive things has a very minor increase, while administrative works go up through the roof. So clearly something that Keynes did not predict, because that means that suddenly it seems to be there's more work than it has been before. And so already said, capitalism should not allow for those inefficiency. If we have more tech and less stuff that needs to be done to have the same standard of living or a slightly higher standard of living. How could that happen? And Graeber made an interesting hypothesis there, that maybe what we experience here is not pure capitalism anymore, but it's rather some kind of a managerial feudalism. So if you think back to feudalism in the early parts of the past not century, millennial? So 1000 plus something. There was a concept where the dominant societal system in medieval Europe, in which the nobility held land from the crown in exchange for military servile, and vassals were in turn tenants of the nobles, while the peasants were obliged to live on their lord's land and give him homage, labor, and a share of produce, notionally in exchange for military protection. That might sound like a long-fetched comparison now, but if you think about it, why do you go to work? Because I need to cover my needs. I do whatever is asked from me, and no matter how stupid or useful it is, I still do that. So there is like some similarity, even though it still sounds a bit far-fetched. The main reason why he's now arguing that there is a closer relationship is that you have a very interesting relationship there with respect to the justification of the work, that you essentially try to exchange what they did, like back then, exchange life for the system. You exchange essentially consumer desires for dull work as a justification to fulfill your desires. And fulfilling your desires is rewarded through suffering of pointless work. And it also explains why various manager positions, for example, are very resistant to downsizing. When he did this research and interviewed a large amount of people, he noticed that there were a lot of consultants among the people who feel like my work doesn't make any sense. My work is pointless. Because they were asked to go into companies and figure out what's the problem. Why is this company, this section of a company performing badly? And they were like, yeah, because there are way too many people in here and you are essentially blocking yourself, or you have too many people for the same amount of work, or like essentially the idea was to downsize or to make teams smaller. But whenever they gave such suggestions, they were ignored, because the manager that loses people working under them loses power and significance. So obviously you don't do that, because suddenly you have less people. And that is one of these things that like very much are similar to this managerial feudalism system. The less people you have under you, the less important you have. How do you measure the importance of a company? By revenue and by people employed. How do you measure the importance of a country? By people living in that country, and by GDP and by military force, which is essentially also people employed under you. How do you measure the importance of a university? Students employed, budget, and work staff. So the more people work for you, the more important you are. The bigger your budget is, the more important you are. And that suddenly then also explains to you why it is fine to have unnecessary work done for you. Because you're not interested in efficiency and doing as much as possible. You're still doing this at a certain level, but you're more interested in having more power expressed by having more people, more budget, more resources under your management. And that being very much contradictory to sufficiency and sustainability paradigms that we have talked about before. You're not okay with having enough to be fine. You want more. You want as much as possible. And now we're like going back, or coming back a little bit around to the sufficiency, efficiency, and consistency problem that we had before, and its relation to sustainability. So Keynes was quite correct with respect to predicting efficiency advantages or advancements throughout the last 100 years. We became way more efficient due to technological advances to do the same amount of work or even more with less people. We looked at the labor force before. Industrial agricultural sector like heavily declined compared to what we had in the 1850s. Service sector went heavily up. And we also had consistency advancements. If you compare how we are producing 1 kilowatt hour of energy nowadays versus back then, we get more efficient. We are damaging the environment less because we're not putting all the stuff anymore into rivers or the environment. We got better with that. But efficiency and consistency advancements did not lead to more sustainable lifestyle. We just increased consuming more. The problem that I highlighted in the beginning of this session. We completely ignored the sufficiency aspects that could come with this. Instead of just saying, look, we're fine now, and we enjoy more leisure time and more freedom, we just decided to consume more and more. And bullshit jobs are just one phenomena that is linked to this. You're doing a job that you don't want to do to cover more and more expenses, to consume more and more, even though you're like, why am I doing this in the first place? So I'm not saying that this is like a carefully designed system, but it's a system that grew out of society as we're running it right now. And bullshit jobs also serve political ends, because one of the major voting reasons for or against politicians is usually, did that politician promise you to create jobs, or did this politician create jobs? Politicians who either because it's their own fault or because unlucky timing ended up being presidents or politicians in a recession, they are rarely re-elected. So they are interested in keeping people employed, but they're not interested in giving them a purposeful job, a job that makes sense. So if you think about a community that needs a certain amount of food, a certain amount of shelters, a certain amount of healthcare, you could just divide this by the number of people that you have, and then like everyone has to work a certain amount of time. And then suddenly you have covered all your needs and the rest is essentially leisure time and stuff. But this doesn't make sense in a political system that we have right now. Everyone needs a full-time job. Everyone needs to keep busy. If not, then you failed as a politician. And there's also another reason why it's quite interesting for politicians and governments to keep everyone working. If you're busy working, and if you're worried that you lose your job and that you don't make or meet ends, then you have less time to think about whether the system that you're living in right now is happy, great, amazing, or just an exploitative shit show. So keeping everyone busy helps to keep the people not happy, but at least occupied. So now what? What's the point of all of this? Why am I dragging you through a series of weird assumptions, accusations, and conclusions drawn from what a dead anthropologist professor was claiming? On one hand, we already connected it back to eco-sufficiency, efficiency, and consistency, and the problems that I just highlighted 1 or 2 minutes ago. But also because I want to get to a point of questioning how much work actually needs to be done, where to get to a sufficiency problem, and what to actually do with people who don't need to work, because we're 8-point-something billion people on this planet. In order to keep people on such a level that everyone can cover their needs and maybe a little bit more, we don't all need to work 40, 50, 60, or 70 hours per week. This is something that comes from overconsumption, and being one of the major reasons why we're breaching the planetary boundaries, why we have a problem with sustainability, why we're suffering from the 3 challenges that we highlighted initially in this lecture: climate change, resource scarcity, and environmental pollution, because we're doing more than we would need to. And getting to sufficiency poses quite a lot of challenges for society, because suddenly, like if you propose to your grandparents or your parents, look, I'm just gonna work 20 hours, they're like, what? Try to propose that to your parents, that 20 hours of work is enough, or try to propose that to anyone who's running a stock, like a company that is listed on a stock exchange. Like, they will go nuts. Try to suggest that to an economy professor who's not like far out on the outer spectrum of this field. They're like, wait, we need to work more because X, Y, and Z. They're always like concerned with more. But the question is why? Because it's gonna reduce our well-being, our lifestyle, what we can afford, but what we have been or getting used to being able to afford, so that it's normal for someone who just finished high school, that they can get in an airplane and spend a year in New Zealand finding themselves and figuring out what is my purpose in life, is something that is, first of all, not the standard of living for a lot of people on this planet, but also a relatively new system. If you ask your grandparents, where did you go on vacation, like assuming that you're not from a family that is very well off in the millions. Like my grandparents, they lived in Rostock and they went on vacation 20 kilometers far away. That was a normal way of living. And suddenly it's normal for us to go for a bachelorette party to Mallorca or like somewhere else by plane for hundreds of euros. So this, like, essentially what I'm trying to do with this rant now is essentially saying we're living above what we can afford. We need strategies to get back to this. And one of these strategies would question the prevalent system of always needing to consume more. And sufficiency would be one approach to address that. So asking ourselves, what do I need to have a nice living? Putting that into the context of sustainability. The planetary boundaries give us an upper limit of what we can afford. For example, in terms of CO2 budgets or resource consumption, water consumption, whatever. What you need to survive gives you a lower threshold. And if there is some space in between the planetary boundaries and what we need to survive, then we also have a certain level of luxurious items, things, lifestyles that we can afford, but only if we share it or if we distribute it fairly among the people on this planet. If people like Elon Musk and other rich people just use hundreds, thousands of times of their share of what we can do, then we're never getting anywhere. So, one point, sufficiency. How much do I need to be happy? A connected question is, if I only need this much, why should I work 40 hours or 60 hours instead of 20 hours? That doesn't stop you from working more, like you can do that, but essentially just to cover your needs. And what to do with your free leisure time and how to maybe put that into another economic system is going to be part of next lecture. So Graeber's solution is the universal basic income, or in German, Grundeinkommen. Bedingungsloses Grundeinkommen, thank you very much. I was so much in my English brain now. Bedingungsloses Grundeinkommen. And another concept I'm going to look at next week is the so-called Gemeinwohlökonomie, or I think economy of the common goods or something like this, where you're not really thinking about how do I make as much money as possible, but rather think about, okay, how do I solve problems of society in an economical manner? Because no one is going to be self-sufficient. Like you can try to grow all your food, but you're never going to be able to grow all your food. Make sure that you have clothes, produce the nails that you need, take care of your own health, produce the wine that you need to get to sleep tonight, build your own house, blah, 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 blah. So you like self-sufficiency as an individual is more or less an impossible, but how can a group, a community, an economy of people more efficiently than we do it right now just cover their own needs without breaking our planetary boundaries? So that was the point of today's lecture, to essentially prepare for next lecture and as a starting point on going beyond the circular economy and getting some intuition of circular societies, like what are the building blocks that we could build a circular society on. Some additional resources, no homework, questions and feedback heavily appreciated, but I will give you 10 minutes to get coffee, relax a little bit. So I would say 10 minutes past 2:30, so 2:40, we're gonna meet back, Q&A session, feedback, thoughts, ideas, and next week, another lecture, the week afterwards, invited lecture. Thank you very much, see you in a few minutes.